France, a country of revolution, protest and long holidays, is going through another economic crisis. Debt is rising and dissatisfaction has hit an all-time high. In the past 20 years, economic growth in France has slipped behind many similar countries, reflecting long-term economic problems. But it is the past 2 years of inflation and stagnant real wages which have really caused frustration to rise. The French have become more pessimistic about the economy than even Brexit Britain, and worse could be set to come, as commentators warn of a Liz Truss moment should new elections lead to extravagant tax cuts and higher government spending. But is it really as bad as it first looks? And can France continue to afford its unique economic model of long holidays, long retirements and a generous welfare state? In the early 1980s, President François Mitterrand cut the retirement age from 65 to 60. A long retirement has become a sacred cow of French politics. And why not? Life is more than GDP statistics. It is to be enjoyed and appreciated, and the French are proud of their balanced approach to life. A typical American works 20% more hours in a year than a French worker. When an American retires, they can expect to live 16 years, but a French worker can expect to live 25 years. So when Macron increased the retirement age from 62 to 64, it was opposed by 80% of the population, leading to mass street protests. When the UK raised its retirement age to 67 by 2028, it was met with barely a shrug. Unsurprisingly, France spent 13% of GDP on pensions alone. It is the third highest in the world and well above the global average. The pension is the seventh most generous in Europe, with pension levels 192% above costs of living. And all this is before a falling birth rate and an ageing population will increase the share of older people in France. France has an extensive welfare state, free healthcare and considerable state intervention in everything from industrial policy to a high-speed rail network, which is the envy of the world. In rail, France ranks 4th in the world, a sharp contrast to its neighbour across the Channel, which struggles to build just 60 miles of HS2. Yet all this state intervention and generous welfare does come at a cost. French debt as a share of GDP is rising and is forecast to keep going up. It's one thing to borrow for public investment, because it can increase growth in the long term. But to borrow to pay extravagant pensions is a very different matter. But with economic growth slowing down, can France continue to afford its luxurious approach to life and work? France is the land of liberty and equality, and also the economist Thomas Piketty, the best-selling author of Capital, an account of how the wealthy have got much more wealthy in the past few decades. And there's strong support in France for the idea that pensions should be funded by taxing the wealthy. Yet even if considered desirable, past efforts have proved less successful than anticipated. In 2012, President Hollande imposed a 75% top rate of income tax, but it was later dropped because it raised very meagre sums as many millionaires simply moved to Belgium. France already has the second highest tax to GDP rate in the OECD and is relatively egalitarian compared to other countries. There's a limit to how much taxing wealth will be able to pay for the continued pension model in coming decades. The really big issue facing France is that long-term economic growth and productivity have slowed down. Since 2009, 2,500 factories have closed down and the industrial sector has shrunk. There's an old joke about French competitiveness which says that made in France means Spanish quality at German prices. Now this is somewhat outdated, but in recent decades smaller French firms have found themselves squeezed by higher volume, low cost Chinese firms and the big US tech giants, which have left Europe in the lurch. At the turn of the last century, France was a net exporter, but now it runs a trade deficit with the Eurozone, and it's seen its global market share almost half from 5% to 2.5%. The French are certainly pessimistic about the state of the economy. Le Monde reports that the three most common words the French use to describe themselves are mistrust, weariness and gloom. 40% proclaim they're distrustful, and ever one of the highest fears have been burgled in Europe. In Germany, the dominant feeling is serenity. 70% lack confidence in politics, compared to 55% in Germany. The French have a mistrust of politics and the highest support for the army running the country, 23% compared to 14% in Germany. Yet the irony is that when it comes to inflation, France had one of the lowest price level increases in Europe. Very large government subsidies helped to keep energy price rises down. It also increased the budget deficit quite sharply. Yet despite this massive intervention to avoid the worst of inflation, the overriding sensation has been of stagnating real wages. Certainly not a unique problem to France, it's been a European-wide problem. A third of French people now feel they are worse off than their parents at a similar age, and this period of stagnant wages has encouraged greater concern about immigration levels. Yet despite the rise of the populist right, the desire to leave the European Union remains low, no doubt influenced by the experience of the UK. Now despite all this gloom, there are some signs of progress. Helped by generous state aid, France has attracted 4 major giga battery factories in the former industrial heartlands of north-east France. It will make France one of Europe's largest battery manufacturers. The Economist notes that behind the mask of protest, France has some impressive statistics. Thanks to nuclear power, it has the lowest carbon intensity of its electricity. It was singularly unfortunate that in the 2022 energy crisis, France's nuclear power was needing maintenance. Poverty levels in France are significantly lower than the rest of Europe, and France has the highest rates of nursery education in the world. Even unemployment, once the great disaster of French economic policy, is in decline. Peaking at 12% in the mid-1990s, it has now fallen to 7% and is forecast to keep falling. According to the French National Statistics Bureau, 68% of people aged 16 to 65 are in work, the highest rate since 1975. Now, the French recovery may have been significantly aided by the state, and it may even have propped up some zombie-like firms and unproductive jobs. But the main issue in the French economy is that it has become better at creating jobs, even if more at a national minimum wage level. France is even attracting more foreign investment than before. Projects are 70% higher than 2014. Yet, despite this relatively good news, it's done little to lift the gloom around the French economy, with the cost of living shocks still reverberating. It has led to voters toying with political choices that will lead to a splurge in spending and lower taxes. Both the far right and far left have policies which would widen an already high budget deficit, and it's caused some commentators to worry about a French version of the so-called Liz Truss moment. French bond yields have certainly climbed in recent years, and given French debt is over 110% of GDP, it's similar to Italian levels just before the Italian debt crisis. It might only take one disastrous budget to push the French economy into real crisis. The truth is that the French economic model is under threat. Ageing population and demographics are only going to make it worse. This video compares the American capitalist economic model with Europe, exemplified by the French model of long living retirement, and I leave it up to you to decide which is the best model.